Nuestros hermanos cubanos necesitan intervención ya.
Los dos portaaviones se ponen en la costa sur y en la costa norte.
Algo militar, todas las opciones tienen que estar sobre la mesa.
Los problemas de los ciudadanos los tenemos que resolver los cubanos sin injerencia, sin ningún tipo de intervención.
Hacen una intervención militar aquí y aquí va a caer cualquiera. No es el que esté de acuerdo, el que no esté de acuerdo, acá va a caer cualquiera porque la bomba cae en cualquier parte.
La gente no tiene idea de lo que significaría una intervención militar para nuestro país. Eso sería un desastre.
No quisiera que Cuba sea ni la estrella de una bandera ni una colonia de ninguna nación.
No se lo vamos a permitir. Y porque aquí hay 20 gente dispuesta a luchar por él. Y entre ellos soy yo.
Oh, good evening, folks. Welcome. Let me welcome the folks that are here on behalf of the Massachusetts chapter of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, and with a special shout out to Massachusetts Peace Action for facilitating tonight's program with Merri Ansara. Merri has been involved in Cuba and US-Cuban relations for more than 50 years, traveling there first with the 1st Venceremos Brigade, and then returning to live and work in Cuba through the 1970s. In the late 1980s, she began working in community development and participatory planning in a collaborative project with Cuban community planners called Common Ground. When the project could not get funding and people began calling for help in organizing their travel to Cuba, she established Common Ground Education and Travel Services, which over 20 years sent thousands of university, academic, cultural, religious, elected, sister city, and humanitarian groups, as well as individuals to Cuba, and assisted Cuban Americans with their required travel documentation. She also worked in the United States from 1969 onward with organizations and groups advocating for normalization of relations and an end to the US embargo, both locally in Massachusetts and nationally. Since retiring from Common Ground in 2015, she has lived in Havana for the winter months, and in the first year of the pandemic, volunteered for her local family doctor for an additional 5 months until she was able finally to return to the US to work on the presidential election campaign. She just returned from another 4 months in Cuba. She was a member of the Communist Party USA from 1978 to 1991, and has been a member of the Committees of Correspondence ever since, at times being able to be more active than others. She's also a member of Western Massachusetts Code Pink, Massachusetts Peace Action, and the Latin American Solidarity Coalition of Western Massachusetts. So I'm honored to introduce and present to you Merri Ansara. Merri?
Hi, everybody. Maybe, host, you might pin me so that everybody can see me large. But anyway, I'm going to carry on. I'm really glad, everybody, that you're here. I really am. I'm not an academic expert on Cuba. Well, actually, first let me say something. I thought that what I had written out was about 15 minutes long, but Cole, who's more of an expert in these things, assures me that it's far longer than that. So to be honest, what I'm going to do is try to rush through that and maybe cut out some things that I really wish to tell you, because I want also to be able to get questions and have a dialogue. So I want to start by saying I'm not an academic expert on Cuba. I have family in Cuba, and I have 50-year friendships in Cuba with people from many backgrounds and walks of life. As Sandy said, I have worked for 50 years in the United States to normalize relations with Cuba. And I've done that side by side with my work for social justice here in the United States, which is equally important to me. to sum up what Sandy said, I have spent 11 of the last 18 months in Cuba. So I feel I have a good handle on what's going on there and what people think, because my friends and families are from all walks of life in Cuba. They're mostly from Havana. I want first to give you my vision of Cuba without an embargo. People tend to think of Cuba as a third world country with a lot to offer, but a lot of problems. And yes, this revolutionary project that has its ups and downs and that we're all rooting for. People think of small Caribbean countries as dependent on tourism and mostly having their cultural assets and history to offer us. Cuba is a great place for tourism, but like most every other country in the Caribbean, it's a matter of economic necessity and a lack of alternatives. And in Cuba's case, the lack of alternatives is in great part dictated by the US blockade. We all know that. My dream of Cuba, after 50 years of watching it grow, develop, face setbacks, both internally and externally imposed, pick itself up, wade through what sometimes seems like mud to get ahead, is a little different. Cuba has a highly educated, highly skilled workforce with a steadily evolving social, economic, political, and gender trajectory and promise. It has one of the most vibrant, tech-savvy young generations one could imagine. More than 70% of the professional workforce is female. I'm going to list just a few of the things that I'm not sure ordinary people outside of Cuba, or sometimes even in Cuba, think about when thinking of what Cuba could do without an embargo. It is the Cuban people who are going to come up with the actual list and then implement it once they're free to do so. And once the Cuban government and state is able to fully implement the 2030 National Economic Plan, which they have. So here's my beginning list. Yes, tourism, especially in the beginning. As the world and the US tries to get COVID-19 under control, Cuba's a safe haven for all-inclusive vacations. Imagine you could go there right now. It has these all-inclusive virus-free havens now. Only, of course, we can't go. People arrive and travel the sanitary corridor from airport to resort in complete safety and security. They're sealed off from the outside world. And the staff works the way they do in the hospitals, which is 14 days on site, 7 days off, 14 days, 14 days on site and at work, 14 days in quarantine, home for 7 days, and then back to in this case, the resort for another round. If the embargo's lifted, we'll be able to go just to sit on the beach the way Canadians do, but we'll be able to do it in safety and as a relief from the surging pandemic, and we'll be able to use our credit cards. For our investors, Cuban medium-sized state and private entrepreneurs will set up call centers so that just as today as a travel agent, when I call Sabre reservation systems for tech support, I'm answered by a center in Uruguay. And when I call Dell, I'm directed to a call center in India. When there's no embargo, I will be able to reach the smart, tech-savvy, highly trained, English-speaking young people in Cuba for customer service, to answer questions, to fix my computer. And maybe they'll have medical record services too, and possibly medical laboratory processing centers. There will be a state UEB, basic economic unit, in my dream, that produces the computers that Cuba has already announced that it can build, with shipping services, just like Dell and Apple have now, and with backup tech support contracts, just as I currently have for my PC with Dell. Oh, and financing for the purchase. When people go to Cuba on business or pleasure, they will be able to take advantage of the many small telephone and electronic device repair shops currently run as small businesses or cooperatives, which are extremely expert, and then will also have plenty of access to spare parts, which is always a problem now. And they can pay for the services by credit card or PayPal. Oh, by the way, dear, I'm just going to run over to the telephone repair shop. This thing's been bothering me for months. I want to get it done before we go home. Cuba will be able to return to exporting hospital and medical record software programs that they used to do to Latin America, and especially places like Venezuela. Maybe they still do. Independent IT contractors will be able to contract abroad in website design and maintenance and other IT services. And they will be able to accept PayPal and other online payment for services. I recently heard a webinar where small independent IT contractors were saying that that was a problem. You know, they had their small business, but they couldn't get paid outside of Cuba. Itexa, which is the national telephone company, will be able to speed up installation of its home internet services called Nauta Hogar, reaching more homes faster because they'll be able to purchase materials for laying cable and then repaving the roads after they dig them up. Internet and data services will speed up because Itexa will be able to access the US control underwater cables running 3 miles off Cuban shores. And then they'll be able to switch from DSL to broadband, so they'll be able to get all our pictures and videos. Oh, and soon will not have to apply for a license from OFAC, which they haven't. People will just have Zoom. Lord will help us. Farmers, both state and private, will be able to revive Cuba's once flourishing chicken industry because they'll be able to get the inputs that currently they cannot. Cubans can stop having to eat that nasty overblown chickens that the US now sends under this thing that they can do with the embargo. Farmers will be able to obtain the various inputs they need for high yield harvests. With collaboration from abroad and plenty of resources at hand, Cuban agronomists and pest control experts will finally be able to overcome the plagues and pests that virtually destroyed the export business of citrus and coffee. Cuba will become a worldwide exporter of medicines and vaccines, but we know that. And they will provide even India a run for its money in making the acetaminophen that we get in CVS. They can do it now, but they can't get the inputs because of the embargo. And people from the US will be able to go to Cuba for advanced treatment for such things as Parkinson's, retinosa pigmentosa, and certain kinds of cancer. Small and medium private businesses and cooperatives will be able to buy at advantageous prices from wholesale depot that the state entities have tried several times to start, but have not succeeded in establishing because they can't get a stable supply. And then those entrepreneurs will not have to travel abroad to get the things that they want to sell or do in their small businesses or in their cooperatives. And they won't have to be able to buy from shady underground speculators. People will be able to buy what they need beyond the subsidized food and hygiene baskets without having to stand for hours in long lines. There'll be greater choice and variety. The country will be able to get the spark pots it needs to keep the electric and water plants going. They'll be able to pave roads. They'll be able to obtain the materials and equipment needed to expand dams and water retention programs. Cuba's solar energy program will be able to speed up their effort to solarize the whole country. And they'll be able to do it not just because there'll be money coming in from exporting doctors and using tourism. They will have businesses that will make money and they will have relations with banks. Okay, that's my pitch there. What happened July 11th? And now the time is going on. When I left Cuba on June 6th, there were 2,000 cases of COVID on average daily. The lines were hours long and tedious. And just at that moment, the major cooking oil factory broke down and there was no oil to be found anywhere. I'm going to skip ahead. People say that people in Cuba are going hungry, and that's not really the case. It's that it's hard to get stuff and it's very expensive. I can go in the question and answer period and tell you how my family members live. And they live on between 5,000 and 10,000 pesos a month salary. And they eat 2 good meals a day. I'm skipping. There have been protests at San Isidro and the vociferous outburst of complaints about cultural suppression and bureaucracy. The Patria Invidia campaign had been launched from Miami, but most people rejected it as anti-Marti and anti-patriotic. People were concerned about certain things, but they were not up in arms, to say the least. They were just beginning to face the fact that President Biden might not do anything to lift the sanctions. People were worried, but hanging on to hope. Biden was not Trump. He had made promises. He just had to get around to lifting some of the sanctions, especially getting back to remittances. I've written more extensively about this in Peace Advocate and also it's in Portside. Within 1 month of when I left, Cuba went from hanging in there with exhaustion but hope to disaster, with many people feeling as though their lives were hanging by a thread. Fueled by Delta, Beta, and Lambda variants, cases of COVID in Matanzas and other provinces rose in 1 month from 2,000 a day to more than 6,000, 7,000, and yesterday it's approaching 2,000. They had to improvise hospital beds for the ill and isolation centers. They had to rush supplies. The medical facilities began to be stressed, and so did the national electric grid. A main power plant broke in the national grid, which in Cuba means, given the US embargo, poor access to spare parts, and then rolling blackouts began to hit. So supposing you are living in that kind of a situation, all of a sudden there's a hurricane or a tornado. Imagine what people were feeling. Not for nothing, the US entities funded and charged with campaigning against Cuba, along with private rightist organizations, not just in Florida, but in Latin America, chose that moment to launch an all-out campaign by every means possible, meaning mostly, but not all, via social media, to fuel protest and subversion. The result was what we saw July 11th. As I see it, the protests on July 11th consisted of different groups. The protests were started with deliberate manipulation and collusion from abroad by small groups of people who were dedicated to overthrow the Cuban government and were joined by vandals and criminals seeing an opportunity for personal gain and destruction. And Brian, if you would put up this video, I recommend people watch it and see actually what went on and what police were responding to. They were not responding to quiet protest. The 140 or 160 people who were arrested for criminal actions and for assaulting police, including biting them and beating them in and out of their cars. There are also people who hate the government, hate the system, and just want to be able to live the way people in capitalist countries live. That's all. I know quite a few people like that. Mostly young people, but also a good many taxi drivers who feel trapped and simply don't understand why there are not more solutions to the ambitions they feel so stymied to achieve. These are people that the party and youth organizations have not been able to reach or engage in any meaningful way to understand or feel part of arriving at the internal solutions that are beyond just the necessity of lifting the embargo. And both the president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has written, he spoke on just a couple of days after the protests about what is really required for the government, the state, and the party to do. And then there's a brilliant article by Fabian Escalante, who's the former head of Cuban intelligence, about what has to be done. And Brian could put those up in the chat too, please.
I left Zoom so that I could send the link to Susan, and now I can't see it again.
All right, let's work on that later. Let's get through this first. You can put that in the chat if you want.
Doesn't work.
There's another group of people who really have a problem with the way so much is centralized for a variety of reasons and belief. They are alienated. Unlike so many governments around the world, the Cuban Revolution has made many promises of inclusion, voice, and progress. And for some people, it seems impossible and unacceptable when it falls short. And when furthermore, solutions seem beyond their own grasp, who can blame them? Goes back to the discussion above. What is the psychosocial paradigm in Cuba, in which Cuba lives, as well as the political and economic one? And people in Cuba are beginning to come to grips that they have to deal with that. And then there's the last group I'll mention who turned out and were simply a large number of people who just felt they couldn't take it anymore. They just couldn't take it. Yes, they'd had their first, second, and sometimes even third dose of the vaccine, but it seemed as though it wasn't going to change anything, and certainly not anytime soon. All of these people blame the government, much as people all over the world blame the government when things go wrong in the public sphere. We elected them and they need to deliver. I'm going to skip ahead. Are we really ending? Oh, we have time. There's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot that has been talked about. There's a lot of information and a lot of good analysis and commentary, especially from Cuba, and also from people in the US who've studied Cuba for decades and are objective and progressive. Skipping ahead. Both Diaz-Canel and Escalante said, we have to work at the neighborhood. Cuba belongs to everyone, and that means that we have to work with everybody. And they really listed the everybody. And Escalante said, today's Cuba in the world is different from yesterday's, and even more different from that of the first years of the revolution, which means it's also impossible to use the same methods of analysis or crisis management as before. There's a young, depoliticized sector of the population, due to our inefficient political and patriotic work, that does not understand. We revolutionaries have to meditate and draw experience from the events that have just taken place. The United States and its fascist government are the main responsible, but, and this is important, we also have responsibilities for the mistakes made. It requires self-critical analysis, not only marginal references. That is what Fidel taught us and warned in November 2005 when he affirmed in a speech in Havana University that only the revolution could destroy itself. So that's what they have to do in Cuba. They have to knuckle down, fix everything that can be fixed, analyze, evaluate, review, and just take care of it. I'm going to misquote Marx. Watch out here. It's people who make history, though not exactly as they choose. What I love about Cuba is they always keep trying. So that's what we have to do too. In my estimation, I'm going to make a very serious statement. Cuba faces the most concerted effort at regime change since the Bay of Pigs invasion. Between SARS-CoV-2 and the rightist and fascist forces in Florida, Washington, and Latin America, Cuba is facing an existential threat. We have to hear that. Cuba believes that it will go on, and yes, Cuba will never surrender. But we have to understand that and face our own responsibilities here. In Cuba, they are equipped morally and politically to take it on and not surrender. They've prepared for decades for the war of all the people. They won't surrender. So what should we do? We ourselves are in a fragmented country with few of the advantages in Congress or in popular sentiment and activity that we had in the years leading up to the Obama decision to move towards normalization. Yes, dozens of cities and organizations have passed resolutions condemning the embargo. We raised enough money from enough people to send 6 million syringes to Cuba. We followed Carlos Lazo and other Cuban Americans in dozens of caravans around the country. We've marched and demonstrated in the streets. We've signed a gazillion petitions. This is all good and positive. We must also, as Diaz-Canel says about Cuba, attend with greater precision to our work, taking advantage of the spaces that exist in our neighborhoods and communities, understanding, as Escalante says, that this world is different from yesterday's, different from the world leading up to the breakthrough with Obama, fragmented and damaged by the Trump years with a vastly different Congress where we do not have the history or the allies we once had, or even that our allies in Congress now have. We cannot present or support bills or agendas that will fail. We cannot take that risk, and we should know this and not press on it. Also, the streets are different. We must go out in the streets, but we cannot be outstaged or outnumbered by right-wing opposition. My moderate Democrat nephew-in-law called me up the other day and said, "What is this? What's going on? Are they in charge of Cuba policy?" We have to review and learn from our legislative and lobbying history, from the work and travel that was in effect building coalitions of the willing. Excuse me. We have to constantly stop and reflect on all our work and on how we are doing, who we are reaching, and who among those are not people we already know. We need at least 110 million people more to be doing stuff to lift the embargo. We don't have enough. We want webinars and actions that are full of strangers. We cannot congratulate ourselves when we get 200 people we know. It's not good enough. We've done excellent work in the city, state, and county resolutions. Not only must we continue that work, but we must follow through, providing them with further tasks like letters, petitions, information campaigns, material aid campaigns, public forums. They represent communities. We want them to bring their community and constituents on board. We must meet them where they are without compromise, but also without imposition of our views. We should never do a one and done. We've done extraordinary work with the syringe campaign. We must follow up that work with outreach to all those donors who put in $510,000 and give them other work to do, such as petitions and letter writing, calls to elected representatives, et cetera, et cetera. We must find ways to engage broader sectors of people. Collection boxes for our next material aid campaigns in churches, like care boxes. Remember care boxes? Forums on Cuban music and dance in restaurants and taverns. Not fundraisers where we have dancing, but going to salsa clubs and organizing performances there. And then while people are there and having a good time, get them to sign petitions. Get them to agree to call their elected representative or donate to a material aid campaign before they go. We who are not Cuban American need to seek out and find ways to help and support those who are Cuban American as they continue to take the giant steps they are towards the head of this campaign we're in. Finally, we need to bring all of the people who do this work together. Policy people, street demonstrators, webinar educators, material aid workers, not to agree on exactly what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Not to say there's just this one right way, but to agree that one way or another we'll find ways to work together and end the embargo. So, before I go to questions, which we'll have a half hour for, I wish we'd had more, I would like Brian to put into the link this letter that Mass Peace Action has actually been circulating, and now the Latin American Working Group and CCDS and others will be circulating it, which calls on our senators and representatives to write Biden, call Biden, sit down with Biden, with the Secretary of State, with the National Security Council, and push him to take the measures that are in that letter. You'll see it if you click on that, that are immediate things that can be done, and to do it without the strings that Biden is attaching. Now, you can't authorize remittances and then make it impossible for Western Union to have a receiving bank. And right now there's no receiving bank. You can't do that with Cuba on the terrorist list when now more than 30 banks have said that they won't accept US dollars. So if we're going to send money to Cuba, how are we going to do it? But we should be doing it. So we have to do that. We have to get Cuba off the terrorist list. We have to get reasonable financial services allowed and permitted again. And then we have to restaff the Cuban embassy. It is simply unacceptable that anybody from Cuba who wants to go to the United States, whether to visit their family, play baseball, or anything else, has to go to some third country at their own expense, pay the consulate a load of money with no guarantee of getting a yes, and then travel. It's just not acceptable. And not only that, it's not acceptable that Cuban Americans can't do what they need to do in terms of consular services for their families in Cuba. It's not acceptable. So you've seen the thing, and now I should stop and we should do questions, because questions are really important. I have no idea what I'm talking about half the time, but I have a lot of information and I can answer a lot of questions.
If people can place questions either in the chat or raise your hand with the Zoom function, or if you don't have those Zoom options ahead of you, maybe say so. So if you put stack in the chat or raise your hand, we'll try to call on folks in some semblance of order. Thank you. I know Merri talked about, referred some questions to the Q&A period. So if that piqued anybody's interest. Also, maybe folks have comments they'd like to add in terms of factual material or in terms of how we can, in fact, stay the embargo and open things up.
Also, people might have things that they would like to make sure that other people engage in as well. Like I've offered up the letter campaign. There's new material aid campaign starting, but many of the people on this call are doing a lot of work and the rest of people should know about it. Well, I've never been on a webinar where nobody has anything to say.
You must have covered an awful lot of good territory. A lot of it new material.
I don't know. All right, I'm going to read this full thing from.
I see that Cole has a question.
Oh, good.
I have some myself.
Or comment.
I'll ask a question. If a question is needed, I will ask one. I was talking to Yoav Elenevsky, who had gone down to the Cuba rally in Washington, I guess it was yesterday or the day before, and he said there were far more Gusanas there than those in favor of solidarity with Cuba there. So, Merri, paint the picture of the the right-wing opposition to normalization with Cuba in the United States at this time. What are we up against politically?
What we are up against is really good organizing. I would maintain that the majority of Cuban Americans, and what are there, about 3 million? I don't know if that's right or not, but the majority of them simply want to mind their business and be able to send money to their family and visit their family. There is really good organizing work going on, and there are a number of people, like my sister-in-law, who, as the years have gone on, have been tainted by lots and lots of Cuban right-wing rhetoric. And I think that the ability of, I think it's good organizing work. That's what I think it is. And I don't, and I think we have to do something to counter it. You know, Carlos Lasso is doing terrific work among Cuban Americans, but we're still so fragmented from the Trump years that it's hard for us to pull stuff together in ways that we might once have. But I don't take that as representing the majority view. I think the majority view is probably, even if they don't like the government in Cuba, they want an end to the embargo. That's, I think, what the majority thinks.
Next up, I see Bill and Mary with a hand up, so I'll put Mary up on the screen.
Thanks. I don't want to get too far afield, but I just have a thought as a nurse coming out of the healthcare industry. My husband and I were in Cuba in 2015 and heard a lot about the successes they've had with research and developments related to medications. And one is a drug called Heberprot B, I think, which is apparently used successfully to enable almost all diabetic amputations to be avoided. And I mentioned this recently to a physician at Beth Israel, asking him more or less to verify what we had heard. And he got all excited and said, I would give anything to be able to test that here. He had another physician in the room with him who was also well aware of it. So my thought is to use some of the medical successes as kind of a wedge issue to start some sort of trade relationship. I'm thinking specific to medicine or healthcare. I just wanted to throw that out because it's amazing what they've accomplished in Cuba, that I think the medical community, I'm thinking of that as a community to target. Again, apologies, this isn't an embargo question, but.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Is it?
It's a very, very important question. And as some people on this call know, I spent the first at least 12 months of the pandemic trying to convince scientists and medical people who used to have exchanges and relations with their Cuban counterparts that there really were exchanges needed and to be had. As I said in my presentation, Cuba has all kinds of medicines and treatments. They, about 35 years ago, they decided to invest heavily in developing their biotech services. And one of the first outcomes was an invention of a meningitis vaccine in time to send 1 million doses to Brazil for an outbreak among children. There is, in Rochester, New York, there is a company that did agree to do joint trials and research on Cuba's lung cancer vaccine, which is also treatment. So you're absolutely right. It's very hard to make that breakthrough. They have, their fatality rate for COVID is far, far lower than almost any countries. And it's because they have developed medicines and treatments and protocols that boost the immune system, and they can, in many cases, control the cytokine storm and avoid the long-term effects. But, in the Fund Healthcare Not Warfare working group of Mass Peace Action, there's been a lot of discussion about this. And one of the thoughts is that at this point, one of the problems is that the scientific community here is in such a state and having such a hard time getting their own research funded that it's hard for them to think beyond that. But you're absolutely right.
I tried reaching out to Jim McGovern's office, and didn't have any success, but I don't know if he was just too busy with other things, but that's my personal interest at any rate.
Well, actually, I've discussed this with him.
Have you?
Yeah, yeah. And at this point, what we have to do, I mean, the panorama has changed just in the last 8 months. We must focus on the embargo now. We must. And if we can make any headway there, for instance, one of the things that letter calls for is renewing the bilateral negotiations and discussions that started under the Obama move. That's the place that'll get taken up again. And in fact, during that period of time, memoranda of understanding were signed between the Ministry of Public Health in Cuba and our National Department of Health and Human Services. So that's there, and we can get there again. And I think if people like yourself can be advocating among the medical associations and communities that you belong for, they can begin to push for that to happen again. They can begin to push the associations, the institutions, the nurses to say, we want access to these drugs. And that moves them then to try to push their senators and representatives in whatever state they're in to push Biden to get back to talks, to get back to normalization of relations, even before we lift the embargo. So I think that would be a very good thing to follow up wherever you are. I mean, I know the nurses in Massachusetts are kind of busy at this moment trying with the strike, but you know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I see that Rachel has a hand up. So Rachel, I'm going to put you up on the screen. Go ahead with your question.
Okay. Hi. Thank you, Merri. This is really important. I have been really astounded at the coverage on NPR and Boston Globe. Mm-hmm. It's totally one-sided. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if that's something Mass Peace Action could help to generate something that we could, send our emails or make phone calls, but, organize us so that we can do that and send a more personalized letter. Or I don't know, maybe we should get on Boston Public Radio or something. There, it's astounding. It's totally one-sided.
Mm-hmm.
Let's hear from Mass Peace Action on that. Unless Harry wants to say something to that subject.
Mm-mm.
Different subject.
Okay,
I mean,
Cole?
Well, so yes, the coverage has really been awful, but MAPA doesn't really have a tool that facilitates sending letters to the editor to different publications, for example, but we certainly can put together a list of addresses of publications and send it. I guess we could send it to the participants today if we have a list of them or something like that, some appropriate list, and call on people to send their letters in.
Well, we did come up with a national press release, and Mass Peace Action is one of the organizations that sent it out. But I don't know that anybody's picked it up, but I also don't know that anybody has followed up to make that happen, because you send out a press release. You don't send out a press release and wait for people to call you. You send out a press release and you call them.
Yep.
But I don't think there's any organized group to do that. But come to think of it, Rachel, here we have the Cambridge City Council mm-hmm. that has indeed passed not one but two resolutions. It would be interesting to see if they would be willing to make a statement, which means also briefing them.
Right.
Harry has his hand up.
But an LTE from the Cambridge City Council would be good. Yeah.
There was, I posted one thing in the chat, which we don't need to talk about, well, except that AMLO has made a public statement criticizing the US blockade. And I think that's important and significant in Latin America. But there were two things I wanted to raise, and one I'm going to be looking into myself. We live my wife and I lived most of our time in Indiana. And back in the day, conservative Indiana politicians and business people went to Cuba to agricultural fairs. And there's been a significant interest among sectors of the agricultural and tourist industry who opposed a blockade for simply their own interests. I saw an article recently posted by someone from a Michigan agricultural publication urging the end of the blockade because Michigan farmers want to sell their soybeans to Cuba. And I think it makes sense for us to think about the panoply of groups, mostly capitalist groups, who have urged the end of the blockade and try and get them to, recommit the way they did 10, 15 years ago. Finally, we spent part of our time in Milwaukee, and we met two extraordinary young women who have just graduated from Elam. And they come back to Milwaukee and speak about their medical training, about the qualitative difference in the Cuban medical philosophy compared with the United States. And they're just so impressive. And the Milwaukee Cuba Coalition tries to foreground them as much as possible in public events. And I assume there are Elam graduates from all around the country who would just be wonderful to promote and publicize. This could be a question, so Merri, respond.
Well, I don't put it in the form of a question, Harry. I'm not quite following the question part of it, though. I liked what you said a lot.
Oh, okay. Well, these ideas sound useful.
Well, yes. And in fact, there's 500 slots for U.S. students at Elam, and they go by and large unfilled. It would be interesting for people to work in their own specific communities, or if they teach at a university, to recruit students. You don't even have to have a 4-year degree to go. And all you have to pay for when you get back is you have to do 3 years of community medical service. You have to work in your community for 3 years. Mm-hmm. So, these young doctors come back and they make a terrific impact wherever they go. We could start sending more. I tried to convince my nephew, but he wasn't convinced.
Merri, this is Dina Tard. My understanding is that it's 10 openings a year at Elam for students from the United States.
Oh, maybe that's changed. It used to be 500, but maybe it's changed. Okay. I don't keep up. But whatever it is, imagine if we were sending more people.
Yes. And I will also say that a lot of people who I know who are informed about a lot of things have no idea that there are US students going to study medicine in Cuba for no tuition, for basic room and board, and a little walking around money. So very often very surprised. And I always talk about the two students. That's all.
Hand up.
Yep, I see that Peter has a question. Peter, I'm going to put you right on screen. Go ahead.
Trying to get off mute. I'm not sure that I have.
Nope, you're good. We can hear you, Peter.
Okay, this is more of a comment than anything. One resource that might be used at public radio that I hadn't heard about from you, although I tried not that successfully several years ago, was to write to the ombudsman. And if there's a problem, at least inform them. They may not react to it particularly favorably, but at least a certain level of responsibility will have been informed.
Well, this all raises a good question. At 7 o'clock, I think it is, there is a meeting of the National Cuba Solidarity Organization, and I'm going to suggest the formation of a press committee. Because what I get out of what people are saying is that we don't have any organized way to actually get stuff into the press. We're mostly left reacting.
Yeah.
Does that sound like a good idea?
Yes.
What do
I mean, we have it, but we don't have it.
Yeah. So.
Wadi has his hand up.
Yes, it's Wadi Halawi, to really thank you for this report and other articles of yours and reports. I missed the first few minutes. I don't know if you addressed whether the situation in Cuba has stabilized or if it's getting worse, or I should mention essentially the emphasis on placing with leaders in China, with whom I'm in almost daily contact, is raising the urgency at this point of escalating cooperation between China and Cuba on a range of issues, including currency issues, because the signs are consistent of growing, of rising likelihood of crisis hitting the capitalist world further. But really, so that's where my stress has gone. It's not new in terms of the necessity for China-Cuba cooperation on a range of questions, including ecological agriculture, but also organization of healthcare. But again, the question is your sense day to day of current changes. Have they stabilized? Are they getting worse?
Well, that's a complex question, isn't it? On the one hand, what's happening is that many countries are rushing to assist Cuba in this current crisis of the epidemic. China has all along sent material aid, and they have very strong relations with Cuba these days. And just one small thing of interest to many of us is that Cuba gets its solar panels from China because they're trying to solarize the country. But they have very strong and good relations. But for instance, Russia has sent 80 tons of aid. Mexico is sending 2 ships. Today, Cuba announced that Cuba and Iran are going to work together on production of the 2 vaccines that are approved for use in Cuba. There's a third that's almost approved. Because what happened is, this is an important little detail. When Cuba got put on the list of countries that support terrorists, that happened under Bush, but in fact, it's in the Federal Register as of May 14th. I just saw that today in an interview with Johanna Tablada, the Vice Director for U.S. Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Relations. And one of the direct results of that is that over the last several months, 30 international banks have refused to engage with Cuba any longer. So Cuba has these vaccines, but we suspect, they're not saying it directly, that they're running into trouble getting the reagents to produce them. They're protein-based vaccines built on their experience with several other vaccines that they have successfully produced. I think that we're going to see more and more countries coming into assistance with Cuba because Cuba has a lot of respect. that doesn't get us off the hook one bit. In terms of the other part of your question, the situation of the pandemic, which is nearing 10,000 cases, and I saw a program the other night of the nightly talk show where they had on the epidemiologists and mathematicians who've been working with this since December of 2019, who showed their models. And this surge is it's not going to peak until probably close to September. They're rushing to get everybody vaccinated, and they will have all of Havana vaccinated within this next week. The rest of the country, and it's a 3-dose vaccine, the rest of the country, they hope to have 70% of the rest of the country vaccinated by the end of August, the adult. They're in trials of their vaccines on pediatric age. So the rest of the country but anyway, they will get the rest of the country vaccinated as a whole by the end of December. But they don't think that they're going to get anything close to herd immunity, even close, until October or November. That means under the current conditions of the embargo, if nothing changes, there is enormous drain of their resources going into, it costs 950 pesos a day to care for somebody who's a contact who's in isolation. It takes 1,450 pesos a day to care for somebody who's in the hospital with COVID, and 13,450 pesos a day to care for somebody in intensive care. My nephew and his wife, he's a cook and she works in administration in a school. They earn together 5,000. And she also makes cakes, and I send 2,400 pesos a month. So around 10,000 is what they need to live on. But the supplies and the resources are not going to be there. Those vandals, if you see that video, what happened in Cardenas, you will see people smashing stores and carrying away stuff. That means if that happened in various places all over the country, that means that much less that there is for people and that much longer the lines. So nobody's starving in Cuba. They can't find an aspirin anywhere. And a friend of mine can't find colostomy bags for his father anywhere. They're not going to starve, but the situation is really, really, really hard. If you remember what it was like for people here in those first months and weeks, remember what New York City was like. Well, take away all the disaster in the hospitals and the morgues and everything, but just daily life, how hard that was. And then ramp it up. That's not going to get better soon. If we can get remittances reestablished, just that, it'll make a huge difference. What the Cuban government has done is they've now said anybody going to visit Cuba, which is mostly family people, because who wants to go as a tourist if there's nothing to do and no place to go, that they can bring in as much food and medicine as they want without any duties on it. People also can take money as long as they don't take US dollars, because the terrorism list means that Cuba can't accept dollars anymore. So people have to change it to something else and then they can take it. So unless we can get at least remittances through, the situation for Cuba, ordinary Cubans, is going to continue to get worse until at least they can get the virus under control. Fortunately, I'll repeat again, fatalities are not the way they are in the rest of the world. For 9,000 cases today, just under 9,000 cases yesterday, they had 68 deaths. That's high for Cuba. But if you do the math, it's not as bad as most places.
going to jump in, Merri. It's 6:30. Some folks may have to leave for a health reform webinar that begins now. Others I know have a 7 o'clock meeting. I know you've told me that you're willing and able to stay longer to entertain questions. So let's consider this still an open discussion. While I have the floor, I just want to make one question or more of a comment with the question, and that is the politics of it. The fact that the Biden administration is not only continuing the blockade, but continuing the extra repressive measures of Trump. So basically, we're calling these measures the Trump-Biden extra measures. And I'm just wondering politically whether that's good. As a retiree, and certainly with the pandemic, I've spent entirely too much time on social media. And unfortunately, at time engaging even in some snipes from Gusanos or those influenced by ultra-right thinking. And the thing that I can come up with is, it's not a question. It is a question of the embargo and the economics. It's not a question of the so-called dictatorship. And that I refer to Cuba as having more participatory democracy than we've ever seen in this country. And I think that's an important thing. Anyway, the politics of it. Do you think Biden is pursuing this reckless course of continuing the Trump sanctions because of the supposed Cuban-American vote in Florida, or is there?
No.
What's behind?
No, I don't think so. I think that's part of it. But here's what I have come to think. I say that there's an existential threat to Cuba. The United States is attempting regime change in Cuba, out and out attempting regime change. The Twitter campaign and the social media campaign against Cuba was funded in part by US sources, in part by South Florida sources, only some of which are Cuban. Don't forget, in South Florida now, there's also Colombians and Venezuelans that the Democratic Party has to worry about and is doing so badly, as well as Cuban Americans. So this was a prelude to an attempt to overturn the government. This is what, and I think there is a part of Biden, if we examine his record, I think this is true. Imagine if you could be the president who went down in history as the one who was able to restore our version of democracy in Cuba. Doesn't that sound quite like Biden?
Yeah.
No? Was there a no? If somebody tell me it's not true, say it's not true. But I think he's torn. And I think Blinken is partial to that idea. The person who's there for Cuba policy, who used to be the Center for Democracy in America, is dead silent. She's not saying anything. At best, they're torn about what they want to do. Part of that is the vote, and part of that, I think, what does it mean for there to be a successful breakaway from US hegemony in the Caribbean? What does it mean? Is it completely coincidental at something from the stars that both the Cuba mess and the Haitian assassination happened within days of each other?
Mm-hmm.
What is the other single success? What is the only successful slave rebellion and revolution in the Caribbean? And look what was done to Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
And can we say that Biden is not the kind of president who would have been there and done that at that time? Does that answer your question? Now all we have to figure out is how to make him do otherwise. Given the Democratic Party we have.
If I can interject, there's a very rapid weakening, of the United States and world capital both on the international scale, above all in relationship to China, but internally, there's effectively a rebellion of the social base of the US ruling class, which is business owners. That's the Tea Party, following effectively events of 2006, 2007, 2008. So this very rapid weakening is pushing the United States into almost desperate measures, in part to achieve regime change, counter-revolution in China. But part of the overall strategy is in relationship to Cuba. So we're foolish to ignore the danger from a weakened but well-armed US ruling class. But we also have to see that effectively a massive weakening of capitalism, there's a danger of a very rapid downward spiral that humanity cannot escape socially and environmentally. But if effectively there's a strengthening above all of China and in many ways Vietnam is favorable essentially to the workers and oppressed of the world. The issue is mobilizing the forces of the workers of the world, including China, including Cuba, to put this beast out of its misery. But that's the overall, and I think that's what the United States is trying to do. It's realizing the rapidity of its weakening and making this desperate effort in relationship to Cuba and to China. On China, the scale of it is phenomenal. And Blinken and Biden's Secretary of War and so on are in on a concerted, well thought out strategy coming out from essentially the think tanks of the ruling class. And so no, I tend to agree with you in terms of, that's what they're attempting. And it would certainly weaken the world working class to have Cuba fall like the Soviet Union fell. So I don't think they'll succeed, but
it won't fall like the Soviet Union.
No, they won't.
No. The Cuban Revolution cannot be defeated from within. Cannot be. There is no significant force in Cuba to make that happen.
Right.
It would take an outside intervention, which is not off the table.
And or environmental.
But Harry wants to talk.
I just wanted to add, the U.S. empire began in the Western Hemisphere, and it seems to me over the last 10 or 15 years, the threat of the pink tide spreading all across the Western Hemisphere has generated enormous threat in Washington. And so I think it makes sense to conceptualize Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, the recent developments in Peru, the underlying support for Correo in Ecuador, the shaky regime in Brazil, the reform regime in Argentina, as all a threat to US domination of Western Hemisphere. And of course, Cuba has been the preeminent inspiration for all of that grassroots mobilization around the hemisphere. So, I think that's how these people in Washington think as well. And makes our problem very difficult.
I think we have
Is
time
Peter's
for
hand still up?
minutes, before I know some people have to break to set up for the next meeting. Who is, anybody have their hand up?
Yes.
Peter has his hand up.
Yes. I'll just repeat the remark that I made in the chat, which is that I'm going to look at that international agency to whom I sent money for the needles. I saw that it successfully accepted my ACH and took my money. I'm wondering if that could be it's a 501c3. I can't remember the name. It's a global something or other. Can they be a useful conduit to helping the Cubans out?
Well, gee, Peter, you've come to the right webinar. there's several of us who worked in that campaign, and I worked very closely with Bob Schwartz, the head of Global Health Partners,
Yeah.
right?
Yes,
We
I
raised
think
$510,000 and are sending 6 million syringes. And we're now figuring out what the next campaign should be.
so I should watch
Whether
for
it
that.
should be medicines or medical supplies. Global Health Partners works in medical aid and assistance with a number of different countries in Central and Latin America, as well as Cuba. And Bob Schwartz has been doing this for about 30 years or more. So never fear, we will let you know soon what the next campaign is. It's actually going to be discussed at the next meeting tonight.
There's a way
the Cuba Solidarity folks.
There is a way that I can structure tax deductible increments that might help me increase the amount I could send.
Well, terrific. Let's be in touch about that when the next campaign goes. I mean, MAPPA has been a big part of that campaign too.
Who?
Mass Peace Action, and will continue to be.
Okay.
You're in the right room.
Okay.
Brian wants to say something.
Oh no, I was just I was applauding. I was thanking Peter for his donation to that very important initiative, and for saying that you want to give more as well. I just wanted to say thank you for pitching in.
You're welcome. Could I send a check? Would that work?
Yes.
There's a specific tax reason for my doing that.
So, let's see. If you go to ghpartners.org,
okay,
you'll find on there right where to send your check. You can Google Global Health Partners, or you can go to ghpartners.org.
So two places.
And no, that's one place. And if you email to me, I will connect you with Bob Schwartz, and you can develop a plan. It's terrific.
And what is your full name? I'm sorry.
It's Merri Ansara. It's actually Merri Ansara, but I go by Merri.
I can't spell that.
Can you see it in the chat, Peter?
I'll look in the chat. I've saved it several times. If it's there, I'll find it.
All right, I just put in, it's, my name is on the screen, and in the chat, it's merri.ansara@gmail.com. And if people have questions, they should feel free to write to me.
Okay, I see it in the chat. I'll mute myself.
Merri, can we get a link to this program? I'd love to send it around.
Which program?
To answer that question, we are recording. We have been recording it, and Massachusetts Peace Action makes good use of its webinars for future use.
We would be we'd be happy to post it on our YouTube channel, Sandy and Merri, if that would be suitable, or if you have another place to put it for CCDS, that's fine too.
That's it. Thank you.
Yep, and just to let everyone know that we will endeavor to send a follow-up email that includes all these important links. You can also save the chat and find them there. But it's good to have it all in one place with a link to the recording as well. So watch out in your inbox for a follow-up email that includes all this information.
Right, and then also, if you want to be on the list to receive further updates and information, you can indicate that there, or you can write to me. Some of you were at this Perspectives from Havana series that Mass Peace Action sponsored this spring. Well, my intention is to start getting written commentaries from a lot of the people who are on that program and some others, like a friend of mine who's in local government, for instance. or some people who are very prominent in the Afro-descendant movement, people who couldn't be on because they didn't speak English. And you'll be able to get that perspective from Havana newsletter once a month.
With Mary's permission, I'm going to wrap it up, if I may. The chat is rich in ideas on follow-up, and I urge everybody always to to save that. Merri, do you have any final words before we move on to many other meetings evolving before us?
Oh, gee, if I could, I would quote from Fidel and his Revolution Is. And basically he says, revolution is changing everything that has to be changed. It's being always honest, moral, and doing what needs to be done for all of the people. And everybody here, I think, I know, not all of you, but many of you, and I know that you do that and you live by that. And so I'm grateful that you came on tonight.
Thank you very much. I believe Brian has the host power.